Okay, welcome everybody to this special webinar hosted by the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore on data protection in a COVID-19 world. Firstly, I'd like to welcome everybody who's attending this live webinar. We've had a phenomenal response to this. It's going to be quite an exciting discussion on probably one of the most contentious topics that people are talking about in these rather unprecedented times. My name is Sam Sharpe. I'm a lawyer based here in Singapore with the firm Sharpe and Jagger. I'm a regulatory lawyer and a disputes lawyer by training. I'm also a member of the British Chamber of Commerce's Financial and FinTech Committee, which is one of two committees which are behind the organisation of this webinar, the Financial and FinTech Committee and the Information and Communications Technology Committee. This event is going to be, as the title suggests, a discussion really on frankly what is becoming more and more of a tension in this fight against the COVID-19 virus. It's a tension between individuals' rights to data, essentially individuals' rights to privacy and individuals' rights to their personal data, particularly sensitive personal data such as one's health data, one's data concerning one's age and gender and ethnicity and so on, and the needs, the public need for data to be used to combat this disease, and particularly in circumstances where there is no vaccine and where there is still a scramble to find some effective way of mitigating the sometimes fatal consequences of this disease. So during the next hour and a half, we're going to be looking at some of the key issues around this tension between these two very great public rights and needs. We're very lucky to be joined by three highly experienced and knowledgeable speakers who are experts in various parts of this field. I will introduce them in no particular order. We have Jacob Turner. Jacob is a barrister at Fountain Courts Chambers in London, and as well as being a well-respected lawyer in the UK, he's also an authority in the field of artificial intelligence and an author of the book Robot Rules Regulating Artificial Intelligence, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. We're also joined by Luke Grubb. Luke is a technology partner at the international law firm Clifford, based here in Singapore. And he's the head of the Asia Pacific technology team. Luke provides strategic and commercial advice on all complex technology matters, with a particular specialism in data privacy, data protection, and compliance with both internationally applicable data protection laws, such as the GDPR, as well as data protection laws within countries of the Asia Pacific. And finally, we're joined by Zheng, who is the head of advisory consulting at ENSIGN Infosecurity. ENSIGN Infosecurity are Asia's largest pure-play cybersecurity services company. Xiang leads the advisory services group that provides leaders with expert counsel and advisory on cybersecurity strategies. By way of introduction on the how this webinar is going to proceed, we will have a brief presentation by each of the speakers on some of their thoughts on some of the key issues arising from this, if you like, tension between the rights of data protection and the needs in the COVID-19 fight. Following that, we will then go into a panel discussion among all of the panelists, where I'll be certainly posing some of the pressing questions that I've got coming out of this topic. And throughout the presentations of the speakers and the panel discussion, those of you who've familiar with Zoom or have attended these webinars will be familiar with this, but there is a Q&A function within the Zoom program, and I would invite all of you to please, as and when you have a question, please write it in there. We'll be monitoring the questions as we go through, and at the end of the panel discussion, which will be around about half an hour, we'll have half an hour to look at some of those questions and put them to the speakers. Again, we've got quite a big turnout today, so please do get your questions in early, and we'll do our best to respond to as many of them as we can in the time available. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Luke Grubb, who will give us his thoughts on some of the issues coming out of data protection in the COVID-19 world. Luke.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about a couple of themes, 2 or 3 themes, really globally impacting coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, and particularly around issues such as contact tracing. So if I can have the next slide. So we've actually seen very different approaches to the collection and use of personal data across the world. I guess it's no surprise. I mean, what we're seeing actually is that reflects the different privacy laws and actually different privacy cultures in different countries and regions around the world. So there's actually not one picture emerging around the kind of privacy or government treatment of privacy in this crisis. If we turn to Europe, even across Europe, where, I mean, you'll all be very familiar with the GDPR, which came in almost just over 2 years ago. But, you know, one of the strongest privacy regimes in the world. Even across Europe, of the 28 countries of Europe, you've got a fairly fragmented approach to this. And the issues that are starting to arise around are things like, you know, what data is being collected. Often in Europe, it's minimal, and often it's pseudo-anonymized, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I know Xiang will talk about the technology a little bit more, but you probably all have been familiar with the Apple-Google protocol, which is called a exposure notification framework, but essentially the using Bluetooth to exchange IDs, pseudo-anonymized IDs between mobile phones, and then obviously if there is a case, then those you can actually look at how those contacts were made over the previous few days. So issues like, you know, where the data is stored, that came up, that's been front and center, very, very controversial. The Apple Google solution is very decentralized. It's stored on the user's phone, and then there's approaches that are very centralized. So in Europe, Germany adopted a kind of fully decentralized model, but the UK started to adopt a very centralized model. The NHS, National Health Service in the UK, was busy building an app which was going to be based on a centralized model of data, but actually it's been abandoned, and we're not really quite sure which model they're going to go for now. So you're seeing quite a lot of fragmentation across Europe, and really along privacy lines, a lot of those things. So for example, France and Germany very much going for a decentralized model, you know, the most secure, balancing data subjects' rights against the public health needs. And then the other end of the spectrum, you've got countries such as China and South Korea, where, you know, actually there's a lot more data being collected. Typically, you've got data, including location data, being collected in many of these countries. South Korea it sort of stands out for the collection of personal data. Where someone tests positive for COVID-19 in South Korea, they have to provide access to their mobile phone, their credit card records, and other data. and that data is actually being fed into an app called Corona 100 meters, and that actually maps those people who've been infected against those who haven't been infected, and it maps things like age, sex, and nationality of those people infected. And what they found in South Korea is actually that you could start to identify those people from just those few identifiers, which is obviously not that surprising. And I think the other areas where it's been hugely controversial, and at the other end of the spectrum, is where data has been released to employers of infected people, and there's been some controversial naming by the employers of people who visited certain districts, for example, where there are gay bars in Seoul. So you can see there's a complete opposite spectrum there from China and South Korea, and then kind of somewhere in the middle is where I would put sort of Singapore and Australia. Obviously, you're all pretty familiar with the Singapore collection contact tracing efforts, but there's the Trace Together app, which is actually doesn't collect or centralize personal data, but if you test positive, then the personal data will be uploaded to a central server, and then there'll be identification of close contacts done. The Safe Entry app for any building it basically does collect personal data. It collects contact details and ID using an ID, a QR code. So really a real wide spectrum between those three different regions and countries. Next slide, please. So Sam mentioned sensitive personal data. Sensitive personal data is only recognized in certain countries. It's not recognized everywhere. And it's typically sort of higher category data, health data, financial data, sexual orientation, political affiliation, those sorts of types of personal data. And under the GDPR in Europe, you have to get explicit consent to process that data. So obviously, most data that we're talking about here in terms of falls within health data. And so you're going to have to get explicit personal consent to be able to process that in Europe. And that causes some potential issues and minimization issues. There are also issues stemming from that around sensitive personal data, and the fact that sensitive personal data, you have to collect the minimal amount possible. You can't collect anything you like, the so-called data minimization principle. And data retention, you can't keep sensitive personal data for longer than is necessary. Again, very strict rules. And export of data from the country where it's collected, again, is a big issue. So this starts to create some key issues for employers in Europe and other countries where sensitive personal data is recognized, where actually it's very difficult to get explicit, freely given consent to collect and use that data, because generally in an employment relationship that can't be given. So it makes it a very difficult issue. And in some countries, of course, collecting sensitive personal data has become mandatory. And so obviously that adds another issue to that, to this. Obviously, in the rest of the world, where there's no restriction on sensitive personal data, there's no issues. And so if a data subject, for example, in a country like Singapore, refuses to log into the contact tracing app, the Safe Entry app, or provide a declaration, then they can be refused entry into that workplace or that public place. The other issue, which is not really sensitive data, but is starting to emerge as a big issue for COVID tracing and the whole issue around use of personal data, is location data. And again, location data can tell you an awful lot about somebody, can be very, very intrusive. You look at the South Korea example, and it definitely can be considered personal data. And that's where, for example, if you've collected some other identifiers of age, nationality, and location, you can probably start to identify those individuals. So it becomes a very big issue. Just on the next slide, anonymization. So is anonymization the answer? Is it right to just say, okay, we'll just anonymize all this data that we're collecting? Well, again, there's no global common standard for anonymization and what anonymization actually means. Obviously, back in Europe, which is again, under the GDPR, tends to be the kind of high watermark, where an individual can be identified from that data or other data, even if that data is held by somebody else, that would not be considered anonymized. So for example, when we're talking about the contact tracing apps, where they're exchanging IDs, and an ID stands for, for example, my phone, it would stand for my personal details, that would be considered pseudo-anonymized. It wouldn't be considered anonymized, because if you put that back together with those details, you would actually be able to determine an individual's personal data. You'd be able to identify that individual, and therefore it's not anonymized. And what you find, of course, is that the GDPR rules still apply to pseudo-anonymized data. There are less, not all of the rules apply, but the majority still apply. And obviously, there's a tension here around anonymized data and being able to get the right sort of data for public health reasons. And that's where, you see approaches like in the UK, when they were trying to collect much more data around location and other things, so that they could use this to track the spread of the virus within certain districts. So you have to be very, very careful, and you have to be very careful about what data is actually being collected. A small sample, as I said, can actually identify an individual and therefore cause unintended consequences. Some other considerations just to think about. Data minimization is a topic that's, again, a very hot topic during these times. Governments need to consider really how to minimize the amount of data actually collected. And then the purpose of collection is another really, really big issue. If you're collecting personal data for one reason, for one purpose, you can't then use it for another purpose. So if you're collecting it to track the spread of COVID, you can't use that for another purpose, such as crime prevention. Data storage obviously becomes a big issue. Data storage and retention, it must be secure, and I know Zheng is going to talk in a lot more detail about that. But it's just worth noting that under the GDPR, some of the biggest fines so far have come from kind of cyber breaches and other data breaches. And some fines have come from where there actually wasn't any personal data actually disclosed, but it was the way that data was kept in an insecure manner. And then data retention is going to be a big issue. How long should governments and other authorities continue to keep this data? I think the Apple, Google data is kept for 21 days, but we are seeing other governments try to hold on to data for longer than that, much longer than that. And when do we consider that this data should be deleted? When this crisis is over? As we said, Sam said in the introduction, when do we think that is going to be? So I guess, just to sum up, really, I think there needs to be a balance here between lessening the impact on the individual of collecting personal data, and then having an impact on that individual's rights. To do with, and the balance on the other side is collecting sufficient data to be able to provide the health authorities and tracing authorities with enough data to be able to use it to help prevent the spread of COVID. So I think those are some of the key issues to start with.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Luke. Look, that's a lot to digest, and really informative. I've been tapping away a list of questions actually to put to you, which I will wait until the other panelists have had their say. But thanks very much. We'll move now on to Xiang, who will give us for 10 minutes his thoughts, and then we'll move to Jacob before the panel discussion. Xiang.
Thank you. So what we've basically been discussing about is about the collection of data, and in this COVID-19 environment, clearly contact tracing apps form that basis of collection of data. And basically what I've profiled is the extremes. South Korea, as Luke also rightly pointed out, is an extremely centralized and extremely transparent means of doing contact tracing. And on the right, you have Germany, which does a very decentralized approach with taking into effects of minimization of data collection and whatnot. And then basically in between, you have the likes of Singapore, UK, as well as Australia. So maybe I'll start with South Korea. So with South Korea, basically they try to aggregate a lot of information together about your personal data, your location, some of your spending behaviors, even including the ability to tap into CCTVs for security footages, to be able to aggregate your behavioral patterns in this COVID-19 environment. And what was extremely transparent that they have done is to expose information portals that share which are the districts or locations that high levels of infections are detected, where these infected people have been visiting, and kind of encourage a social behavioral change so as to be able to avoid some of these locations. But that naturally also leads towards some of the classification of certain people, and that might lead to some other social distress. And this kind of transparency is actually done in an automated information sharing format, of which day to day they are updating this data set, and they continue to train their AI and ML machine learning models, which I'm sure Jacob will touch on a little bit later. Then we have on the extreme right, which is Germany, where they've taken the extreme sense of decentralization, particularly using Apple Google's exposure notification approach, of which the infected parties' IDs in the phone are then shared across only when they have been confirmed to be an infected party, and no exposure deliberately from the government standpoint to share that this is an infected person or not. And in that approach, basically they have adopted the highest level of adherence to data privacy regulations in the GDPR. I'll go on to UK for now, and that's basically with the NHSX application, which has now since been put on limbo a little. But with the first few versions of the application, basically what they were trying to come at was a bit more of a centralized approach. There is the sharing of these ephemeral IDs of the persons infected, and using this central database to basically support contact tracing and link tracing, more importantly. So drawing relationships between infected persons and those who they have been in contact with. So that basically leads towards a more semi-transparent approach, but it relies a lot on self-declaration, that the individual actually professes and consents towards the sharing of this information. Somewhere in between, we have Singapore, and for those of us which are residents in Singapore, we know that basically we started off with the Trace Together app, and then we launched the Safe Entry scheme. So the Trace Together app, just an introduction, would be a mobile application that's installed on people who volunteer to be a part of this whole scheme, and to be able to then detect when another party using a Trace Together app comes together and just log these proximity records together. Now, when any one of these persons running this application gets detected or has been diagnosed with COVID-19, this information is then shared with the authorities so that they can trace through all the close contact parties that have used this Trace Together app and was in close proximity. Now, with that, basically, there is a push down notification from the server, and there's no means to decrypt the information. And that's really on the Trace Together app. With the Safe Entry, basically, by adding additional legislation, they made it mandatory that if you are to enter a physical premise, you have to check in. And that basically shares your national identity number, as well as your telephone number, so that you can be traced and contacted when necessary. And so this is the more centralized collection of information that Singapore has. And in this scheme, basically, we have the semi-transparent approach. The government basically gets more frequent information of the population's movements, but it is kept within the government. So assuming and establishing that social contract with the population, basically the government takes care of all this information that's there. So if I can move into the next slide. the real challenge with technology is that every technology has cybersecurity flaws, and the impact of data breach can be significant. We look towards on the left. It's basically that any data breach that contains personal identifiable information is detrimental to the individuals impacted. And because there is this reliance on the party that's holding on the information, these parties, third parties, basically form what we call the watering hole risks because of the centralized storage of information. A bit closer to home, Sing Health data breach in 2018 that was quite publicized. About 1.5 million personal identifiable information was leaked. And it was then mentioned that the threat actors actually were focused on politically exposed persons, for example, our Prime Minister. Then maybe a little more on other examples would be American Medical Collection Agency, where the data breach actually exposed 24.4 million patients' data in a similar fashion. And also, when we look at the applications, they really rely on more and more on cloud technology. So cloud platforms, and they might be hosting it for example, in Amazon Web Services, in Microsoft Azure, or even in the Google Cloud. And in recent times, in the last 2 years, we've basically been observing that misconfiguration of these data storage services basically result in the loss of such information. And it's something that we need to watch out for. Now, in the middle, basically, we have observed in our threat intelligence that malicious surveillance campaigns are actually carried out on politically exposed persons and socially influential persons. Going back towards the Marriott data breach, of which 5.2 million of the guest records were basically leaked out. And similarly, for the Shangri-La data breach, where 4,300 members' records were leaked. Now, thematically, these two data breaches have the same effect, and deeper studies actually prove to us that some of the threat actors were actually using these records to, number one, observe the guest behavior, especially for the politically exposed persons, as well as the socially influential persons, tracking their traveling behaviors, tracking their personal behaviors in terms of what their preferences are, so as to be able to do extortion or even surveillance on their actions. And this could lead to basically certain influence campaigns. For example, if there's an M&A involved, they might make use of some of the not so savory behaviors that they have observed to be able to extort on these persons' data. And also whether when we look into Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, basically we have this Shangri-La dialogue that runs annually. And it's basically to discuss national security issues around the region. And so these means that they can use this information to do influence or extortion. And the last part is really a reminder that technology vulnerabilities and cyber supply chain risks exist in all solutions. When a lot of these contact tracing applications were first developed in a rush during the COVID-19 inception, Bluetooth light, low energy was one of the technologies that were used. And there is something to say that there's this vulnerability known as swing tooth that is embedded in the technology itself. And it's not easy to be resolved or patched. And the reason is basically this. Mobile phones, nearly everyone has mobile phone, but all of us are using it at different versions. Some of us may be holding on to 5-6 years old phones that don't get further support and updates. There will be some of us that have more updated phones. But in that variety and that spectrum of mobile phones that everyone holds on to, there will be parties that are exposed to these vulnerabilities that can be leveraged on to compromise the data set that in contact tracing. And just looking at the NHSX application, the initial versions were quickly discovered to have 7 vulnerabilities, of which kind of the NHS did not move forward with patching the vulnerabilities. They've kind of given it up altogether, and all of us are just monitoring to see what is the next solution that they're going to put on the table. And if we look into some other alternative applications, so Kaspersky is a company that produces one of the prominent antivirus solutions, and its application itself had vulnerabilities that allowed the leakage of defense documents in the US, mainly through their quarantine feature. And lastly, software vulnerabilities in the security vendors' devices actually exist quite prominently in recent times due to the wave of work from home arrangements. VPN solutions as well as virtual desktop infrastructure solutions have been found with a lot of vulnerabilities that basically compromise organizations. And also in a similar light, the three dominant antivirus solutions providers were actually found to have their source code for their security solutions exposed. And this basically expands the technology vulnerabilities that everyone is exposed to. So just to kind of wrap up, I think going back to what Luke said, privacy is really a culturally sensitive or society sensitive matter. I think different cultures and societies have different views of what they need to protect. So that basically led towards different countries taking on different approaches. And with all these kind of technologies, I think in the rush, it is necessary for us to be cognizant that there are vulnerabilities that exist, and there are past cases that are out there where such solutions have broken down. And it is something that all of us should be concerned about. And how do we actually keep the people that have processed and stored our information in check so that the privacy can still be maintained in a reasonable level.
Thanks, Xiang. I mean, that's the thing that concerns me about this this situation at the moment is, and we'll talk about this in the panel discussion. But what you've got is a new disease. Nobody quite knows yet exactly how to prevent it, and therefore nobody quite knows yet what sort of data is necessary, how that data should be captured, how that data should be stored. And at the moment, you've got a very, certainly to me, you seem to have a very disjointed approach of a lot of very sensitive data being collected by a lot of organizations in the absence of any real framework in which that data should be managed, obviously with the exception of the current data protection regulation. And I think that scares me, to be frank with you, that scares me. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. So we talked in some length about the data gathering process and some of the challenges around that and some of the technologies for that. But I'd like to sort of step now from the sort of the reactive approach going forward to the more proactive approach and how technology can be harnessed to use this data for good, but also the risks associated with that. And obviously the watchword that everybody's talking about is artificial intelligence. So we're very lucky to have Jacob, who's going to give us his thoughts on that aspect. Jacob?
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to the British Chamber of Commerce for hosting. As Sam has just mentioned, the next step after looking at what data is going to be used is to ask how that data is then going to be made operational in terms of the inferences that are drawn from it and the analytics that are undertaken using that data. And as Sam has mentioned, one of the main technologies which is used to decide how data is going to be used is artificial intelligence. But the word artificial intelligence doesn't have a centralized definition, and often we can get into difficulties when discussing it because each person will often have their own internal understanding of what AI is. So I'm going to start off by giving my definition of artificial intelligence and suggesting why it is unique from a legal and regulatory perspective. Can we have the next slide, please? So my definition relies on a distinction between automation and autonomy. automation describes traditional computer programs. Automated programs are not, in my view, artificial intelligence. And the reason is this: automated programs rely on a series of logical instructions. If X, then Y, if Y, then Z, and so on and so forth. So every operation that a computer program which is automated undertakes has been pre-programmed, it has been input by a human programmer. There is no discretion on the part of an automated computer program. So with a given input, you would always have the same output. It's like going up to a vending machine and pressing the button for a Diet Coke. You will always get a Diet Coke coming out. Autonomous programs, autonomous systems are different, and these, in my view, are artificially intelligent. Autonomous systems have a degree of discretion. That's to say that the inputs don't necessarily always lead to the same outputs. They can learn, they can develop as more data is fed into them and as they get feedback from those data sets. Typical types of autonomous technology that we see a lot of being used today include machine learning and its various subsets like reinforcement learning, deep learning, supervised and unsupervised learning. Machine learning isn't the only type of autonomous technology, but it is certainly the most common one in commercial use today. So if you or your organization are using machine learning, then that, in my view, is artificially intelligent. And by way of explanation of the difference between the diagrams on the screen, whereas in automation you have these set links between each level, under the autonomy arrow, we can see that each of the nodules, each of the circles have many different links between them, and that is intended to illustrate the way in which the system can learn and can build and can change the connections between its individual neurons, much in the way that a human brain functions, and that's the way in which autonomous systems have been modeled. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, I realize that the distinction between autonomy and automation can seem quite abstract and esoteric. So I'm going to try to illustrate why AI, why autonomous technology is unique using a true story. And that is the story of DeepMind and its program Alphago. So DeepMind, as you'll probably be very familiar with, is a originally British company now owned by Alphabet, and it specializes in artificial intelligence, in particular deep learning technology. In 2016, it released a program called Alphago, which was designed to play the ancient Asian board game of Go, which, as many people in the audience will know, is much more complicated than chess. And it was said by many people, Go experts included, that it would be impossible for a computer system to beat a human champion because it is simply too difficult, too complicated. It relies on too much intuition to play this game to an expert level. But in 2016, Alphago did beat a human world champion, Lee Sedol, at Go in a best-of-5 series of games. But what was exciting and what was interesting about this event was not that the computer beat the human champion, because we know computers have been beating humans at board games for many years. If you think of Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov, the chess champion in the late 1990s. What was interesting about Alphago and what was novel was the way in which it beat Lee Sedol. And there was a particular moment in the best-of-5 series of games that illustrates this. That was Game 2, Move 37. In this move, Alphago did something which baffled everyone watching. The programmers had no idea why it had taken this move. The Go commentators watching couldn't understand it. They all thought it was a mistake. It turned out, several hours later, that that was the winning move. Essentially, Alphago had thought of a new way of playing the game of Go that no human had come up with in the thousands of years of history of it being played. So that's an example of the unique ability of AI technology to surprise us, to go beyond what the programmers had thought was possible in unpredictable ways. And as we can see from the Go example, that can have very positive results, but it can also have negative results. And I'll come on to discuss those in a few minutes. Can we have the next slide, please? The next thing I'm going to talk about is the use of AI and its impact combating COVID-19. Moving on to the next slide, please. So there are two main areas in which AI has been deployed in order to combat COVID-19. The first is in terms of finding a cure, and there are many pharmaceutical uses of AI. One of the advantages of AI is that it can be used to process huge amounts of data, which would take a single human thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to look through. So they can greatly increase the speed of certain operations, and some of these things are very well suited to drug discovery, as has been shown in various commercial applications to date. There is a well-known Baidu program. Pharmaceutical companies like Exscientia and Eli Lilly are using AI in drug discovery and clinical trials. And likewise, some of the main technology companies, IBM, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, have been using AI to process large data sets in epidemiology and related fields, all with a view to finding a cure or to finding some kind of a therapeutic treatment of the symptoms of COVID. The other main use of AI is in terms of stopping the spread of the disease. Flattening the curve is the common term that many of you will be familiar with. And it's perhaps in this area that there are the more pressing issues from a regulatory perspective, because unlike pure scientific discoveries where it's fairly difficult to see a negative impact from AI use in drug discovery, where we start to have AI interacting with human sociology, with political decisions, that is the area where there is perhaps a tension. So AI can be used to review data sets in order to detect the spread of the spread of COVID. And for example, one of the interesting uses of this to date, and the veracity of this is debatable, but it is a use, is that it's been applied by some scientists to the city of Wuhan to look at various different data sets to try to work out exactly when the virus first emerged, and potentially to push that back a few months before the virus was commonly thought of as having emerged. So AI can sometimes be used to garner insights into human behavior that would be very difficult to spot otherwise. And as has been mentioned by Xiang already, AI has been used in certain population tracking apps. So we've spoken a lot about all the data that's been used, but what I'm going to be looking at is the inferences that are drawn from that data and the decisions that are made based on that data, and often those decisions will be informed by AI. So let's move to the next slide, please. I'll turn now to the regulation of AI, the emerging picture, and how that can be applied to the way that AI is used, particularly when dealing with and attempting to assist with the fight against COVID-19. Can we have the next slide? I'm going to look at the UK and Singapore, and this is not just because we're speaking under the auspices of the British Chamber of Commerce of Singapore. It's because the UK and Singapore are two of the world leaders in the regulation of artificial intelligence. We already have a fairly developed worldwide regulatory regime with regards to the protection of data, and AI often uses a large amount of data, but I'm not looking so much at the personal privacy aspects of regulation, which have already been expertly covered by the other speakers. What I'm interested in is the regulation which covers decision making by AI. So how should AI take difficult decisions? Are there any constraints which should be placed on that decision making? And are there perhaps any decisions which AI shouldn't take? Should there be some situations where a decision is so difficult, so sensitive, that we always want to have a human making the final decision there? And what we're starting to see, both in the UK and in Singapore, is an increasing level of detail of AI regulation. Now, in both countries, the regulatory proposals and recommendations are non-binding, but they are nonetheless extremely helpful to organizations in setting best practices and standards. And I think in due course, we are likely to see regulatory enforcement action based on these AI standards. So what kind of things do they include? Well, one issue of with AI is that it can be a black box. It can be very difficult for a human to understand or interpret why AI has taken a certain decision. And we've recently had in the UK guidance from the Information Commissioner's Office, that's our version of the PDPC, which gives very detailed guidelines on how organizations can make their AI sufficiently explainable. Now, this can be useful with regards to the way that AI is used in COVID-19 tracking, because if an algorithm gives a certain recommendation that, let's say, a particular city, a particular district ought to be locked down, you may want to ask, well, why has it recommended that be locked down? And are we sure that it is appropriate? So some of the things that AI can do very well are be blind to certain factors that might distract humans, but blindness to other factors can be highly problematic. So to give one example in terms of COVID-19, we know from the data, particularly in the UK and also in Singapore, that COVID can have a disproportionate effect. It can spread very quickly amongst certain subsets of the population, particularly certain ethnic minorities or migrant communities where the living conditions might be different from elsewhere, the social interactions might be different from elsewhere, there may perhaps be less engagement with national news and national health guidelines. And what you may have potentially with an algorithm which gives automated recommendations of lockdown is you may have discriminatory outcomes where there is a recommendation that targets, perhaps unfairly, a certain area of the population which might be contrary to civil liberties or equalities laws. And it was really interesting to hear how Zheng was talking about how in South Korea, the government has been very keen to use automated technology to make these recommendations about what should be done in terms of lockdowns. I had a quick look at the CIA World Factbook on South Korea, and one of the really striking things about the ethnic breakdown is that it's described in one word: homogeneous. So in South Korea, you basically don't have the type of ethnic diversity that we see in the UK and in Singapore. And so for that reason, it's much easier to implement these automated AI-driven solutions because you don't need to worry about discrimination. Whereas in other countries like the UK and Singapore, one needs to be much more careful about these sorts of things. And so we have certain regulation in place, which is likely to affect and manage the use of AI, but it remains an ongoing struggle for governments to balance the safety of populations against the need not to discriminate. I'll close there and hand back over to Sam.
Okay, there's a lot to talk about, and we've got quite a few questions coming up, which we'll deal with. I'm just conscious of the time. What I might address some of the questions during the panel discussion as well. Let's start with that last point that you referenced, Jacob. I have a burning question when it comes to AI. And the whole difficulty with this pandemic is things are changing. You know, this disease is not understood. What is important even 2 months ago in terms of determining is somebody high risk as a potential carrier keeps changing. They're now saying it's going to be airborne, for instance. That's what some of the news reports are. That creates a huge amount of new possible data that needs to be looked at. But one of the interesting things which I've been reading is this within countries, this need to begin to not only start to put in lockdowns in different states. For example, Melbourne, for instance, and Victoria apparently is closing its borders with neighbouring states in Australia, but also in respect of different parts of the city. I believe you've seen this in India. The the opportunity and the worry there when it comes to AI, and it brings me back to the example that we have here in Singapore, where the and I've spoken with this with Zheng before. Singapore uses the IBM AI program Watson to help manage traffic. Okay, it's very clever. They put a lot of data into this, on traffic data, very banal traffic data into this program. And then it allows information to be given to the government, which allows then traffic to be managed. Okay, I'm no traffic expert, but it's not 100 miles away to take the next step to say, okay, we can put a lot of privacy data, a lot of data to do with this health crisis into something like IBM Watson, and then we can start demarcating what parts of a city or a country can be traveled to, what the rights of citizens are in those particular city parts of the city or parts of the country. And when you put that in the context of, let's say, issues of discrimination, limits on freedoms, and so on, do you see a real danger that AI could be end up really giving some bad outcomes, notwithstanding that the best intentions of trying to deploy it?
I think that is certainly a danger, and that's why that great care needs to be taken in rolling out AI and making sure to the greatest extent possible that the AI, when it's being used, is complying with best practices. For example, explainability. And you're quite right to highlight these unforeseen consequences of the use of AI. Another example of AI being used in traffic management is that in Canada, I believe it was, apps on phones were used to work out whether pothole repair was needed. And it transpired that all of the pothole repair recommendations were in relatively wealthy areas and very, very few in poorer areas. And this wasn't because there weren't any potholes in the poorer areas, it was because much fewer people in the poorer areas had smartphones with the app installed. And so these sorts of unforeseen issues which can arise with the data input into AI can be extremely important. And this, for example, is one of the difficulties that there has been concerning the use of apps on mobile phones, that certain areas of the population, for example, older people, may not have smartphones. And so therefore, tracking their movement can be much more difficult.
That's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned that, and actually that leads me on to a point I guess I wanted to put to all of you and so see what you think. One of the issues that Luke and Zheng were talking about comes down to whether it's necessary to have a centralized or a decentralized approach in order to gathering data on COVID-19 and people's health situation in order to protect them and the wider public. Is there a case, do you think, for more government involvement in collecting that data? Because at the moment, the data privacy regulations are not sufficient to really manage the volume of this data that's being collected and the security risk. And do we need to be relying more on governments to collect that sort of data?
Sam, I'm happy to take that one. I think ironically that will actually create more problems. I think ironically, you know, what's been shown even in a short time of this crisis is that actually a sort of federalized approach has caused issues. And I think actually you could say that some countries and regions where you've got a federalized approach, actually you've got you present more problems. So in the US, for example, I mean, maybe this argues the other way, but in the US, it's been largely left up to each state to decide what they're going to collect and how they're going to actually, in terms of personal data, and how they're going to actually control that. And what you've seen is some states decide that they're collecting more than is necessary. So they're collecting things like physical and mental health status. And then some are just excluding some areas of personal data from the legislation. So some states have said, well, will exclude any employee personal health data required to enter a workplace. That's just not required to record or have any laws around that. Now, so you can see that actually, I think the biggest problem is, you know, and I'm sure Zheng has got views on this in terms of the cyber risk, but actually what we've seen is governments that are centralizing this and are collecting all of this data. There is less trust, I think, from the public within, you know, for that approach. And that actually creates an awful lot of issues. So in fact, you get a lower number of people actually signing up to these tracing apps, etc., and for that technology. So I think that could actually create a bigger problem.
I think for me, there's no immediate right or wrong answer towards the approaches. From a purely cybersecurity angle, as much decentralization is preferred, because then you have segmented the data sets such that it's, in a sense, minimization and reducing the opportunities for the one chance that I capture one repository, or I exploited one repository and I have all the data that I need to be able to exploit. On the other hand, when we look into the cloud of COVID-19, there is a mission at hand. And the mission is to be able to perform link tracing or contact tracing to the extent that it can help public healthcare identify the right people to bring in for treatment and to contain the spread of the virus. So in that sense, that's why I'm also seeing that more centralization has taken place, and that governments are taking on that burden of protection for their citizens to be able to then perform this mission. But that said, I've also highlighted earlier in my slides that every technology, there's a set of vulnerabilities, and it's a cat and mouse game that doesn't end. You constantly need to identify the vulnerabilities, quickly patch it up, and then continuously discover more. What I would say to that extent is that, in my opinion, it is better to put this kind of data in the hands of a more resourceful organization, i.e. the government, than compared to, say, I rely on a third party to hold on to this data, where their resource availability is clearly lesser, and the ability to master these resources to be able to defend and protect this information is less likely to be robust. So that's just my two thoughts on that. I don't think there's an immediate yes or no. In the end, I think it goes back to this notion that in different cultures and societies, there is a different appreciation of what is privacy and what is sensitive information that needs to be protected. Drawing back to Singapore, I think there is a social contract that citizens and the population has with the government, and that we rely on the government to protect our interests. So that's just kind of how it is in Singapore. And in Western countries, there will be a different appreciation where there's always this sense that, you know, I think I can protect my information better. But as it is also highlighted in COVID-19, the individual doesn't know better. And we have individuals that for their own interests deliberately hide that, you know, I have been infected, or I've been in a location where an infected person is, and I may not want to share this information for you. So for the greater social good, a purely decentralized and an individual-centric information volunteering approach might not be beneficial for us to contain this situation.
I mean, it's pure speculation, and the cultural point is interesting. I mean, if you look at some of the where the majority of the cases are, maybe an argument could be made that in countries where there are large numbers of cases, there's much more of a focus on individual rights when it comes to things like data protection. Whereas you look at countries, you know, where there's much more of a sort of a communitarian approach, a sort of more of a trust in governments and institutions, the track and trace approach of using data in that way has been more effective, and hence we see fewer cases. That could possibly be an argument that can be made. The other point that springs to mind is, how do you get individuals to give that data? You know, we've had track and trace in Singapore. There hasn't been a great uptake. A lot of this information gathering is dependent on either somebody having a mobile phone and being able to use it. And I know in Singapore now there's a proposal to issue dongles to people, so that will sort of help gather the relevant data that can be then used for a centralized track and trace. But the reality of the situation in a lot of countries in the world is that we're seeing a lot of organizations and private businesses being required to actually collect this data, store it, but they're, and do correct me if I'm wrong, I'm looking at Luke here possibly, you know, is the framework really there to manage that process? And are businesses and organizations, could they be in the firing line if they start collecting the sensitive information, particularly those who are subject to GDPR? And just one final point is, because one of the first news stories I remember coming out in March were various European countries suspending the GDPR to allow data collection to sort of presumably occur more freely to combat COVID-19. I mean, is there a case, Luke, that there needs to be a rethink on some data protection laws, if anything, to just make them more practical for organizations who are having to collect all of this health data?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points in there, Sam.
Sorry, I tend to talk a lot. Yes, you are right.
No,
pick and choose which ones you want to talk about.
I mean, it's interesting. I was just going to pick up on the point that you made about perhaps you know, more I suppose privacy conscious countries, you know, having a less you know, efficient or good use of this tracing solution. I think I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, I think if you look at, you know, Germany, for example, Germany's actually stands out in Europe as being one of the best places, and has actually got the strictest, as Zheng was talking about, has got the strictest regime for lots of historic reasons in terms of personal data. But I think it's very difficult. There is no, comes back to what I was saying, I don't think there's one right answer here. I think that there have been some significant issues in some countries, and I think that where you force people to adopt certain technology, that can be a real problem. I mean, a good example is Qatar. In Qatar, apparently they made it mandatory to actually use the tracing app that they had, and it collected all sorts of things. It collected a lot of sensitive personal data, health data, all sorts of things. And it turned out that actually there was a massive cyber flaw in that app, which basically exposed over 1 million people to their personal data, you know, to the public. So I think that to me that demonstrates that making it mandatory, I mean, there was a fine and 3 months imprisonment if you didn't download the app. Making it mandatory and then not making it secure and collecting too much data, sensitive personal data, and centralizing it is a big no-no across the board, right? So, and it probably didn't help in terms of public health aims either in Qatar. I don't think. I have no idea, but it certainly exposed those citizens' data to really unnecessary risk. In terms of the suspension of the GDPR, I mean, I think there's been some talk about it. Hungary talked about the fact that they were going to suspend certain parts of the GDPR. The European Commission came back and said basically there was no reason for them to do that. If they were going to suspend certain parts of the GDPR, they had to kind of balance again this data subject rights against the public good that would be gained by this, it's essentially suspending parts of the GDPR. I mean, I don't think the GDPR has been the problem. I haven't heard anything around people saying that actually it has made contact tracing impossible or anything like that. I think it just needs to be actually, and in fact, I think that the GDPR has actually driven a better level of privacy around the world. We're seeing a huge impact in places like India, in California, even in Singapore. We're seeing an impact where regulators are picking up on GDPR concepts and saying, actually, yeah, we need to adopt the same sort of approach or something similar, given the differences in our culture. But so I think, maybe a little bit wordy, but I think that issue, having stricter privacy laws has not created that tension, I don't think, of not being able to contact trace or whatever. I think it's more about how you actually, what you collect and what you use it for, is a key thing.
So what I just want to come back to Xiang on, in your experience then, and I guess the difficulty is that there isn't a consistency in the sort of data that's being collected. But certainly in my experience, I mean, I run a business, we're asked to collect sensitive data to use even the GDPR definition of sensitive data, health data, and so on people who come into our office, their temperature, for instance. My first question is this: are you seeing organizations now being required to gather a lot of this data and hold on to it? And my second question is do you think that those organizations could be put at risk if there is a data breach, whether that's by accident or by some sort of malicious actor?
So I think also riding on what Luke shared earlier, I think definitely organizations are finding this responsibility that has been placed by the government to collect some of this data. Temperature basically would be in Singapore that all businesses need to monitor twice daily the temperature of their employees. So that's the minimum information that they need to collect already. And it would at minimum be tied back to, say, their user ID or email accounts that they are using for their business purposes. And that being said, I'm aware of at least one other example in the Big Four that they have actually issued, similar to what Singapore is trying to do, the Trace Together token. But they have basically asked for all their employees, when they are in the office premises, to carry this token about, so that they can monitor where in the building they are. And it happens to be, that they have large premises, right, the Big Fours. And so they are then monitoring the location, what are their behaviors, how long they dwell in particular parts of the office premises and things like that. Okay. So it's spot on that you've highlighted that, with these organizations now storing this information, they become a repository that would be of interest to threat actors. And it's really down to how much competency does each of the organizations have to be able to protect that information. Now, this kind of government expectation on businesses applies to both the small and medium enterprises, the sole proprietors that are running freelancing opportunities maybe, and also the MNCs, the larger scale organizations. Now, clearly, as I also brought up the idea of resourcefulness, the MNCs will probably be at a higher resource, they will have more resources at their disposal to be able to protect the information of the employees. But when it goes down to the SMEs or even the sole proprietors, the level of resources that they have would be also smaller. And then I bring a different dimension, which is the competency. The awareness and ability to address cybersecurity concerns will clearly be different. The MNCs will have no shortage of people that are mindful and able to say, okay, these are information security principles that I need to apply on these systems. There are privacy concerns. I might actually have a data protection officer within the company. But when you go down to the SMEs and the sole proprietors, it's all a one-man shop kind of thing. And they are struggling with the day-to-day economies of running a business as compared to, what is the data privacy thing that I need to take care of.
Yes.
So that's really the conundrum that we're facing, rather than to say, is there a framework? Even if the framework is out there, the resourcefulness of this classification of companies and businesses will already put them at a different positions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to change chat tack now, and a burning question I had for Jacob, and forgive in advance a rather long introduction, but I'll just explain my sort of train of thought here. To me, in a lot of countries, and certainly in Singapore, you're beginning to sort of have this policy problem where, you know, you can't shut down your economy forever. You've got to come out. And you're seeing in countries that as you begin to ease the lockdown, you begin to get cases springing up. You begin to get sort of clusters, and there's appears to me, and I'm no expert in sort of social policy, but there appears to me there's going to have to be some sort of dynamic response to this, to outbreaks. Rather than shutting everybody down, you're going to have a much more targeted response. And it seems to me that the AI at least provides, certainly from what you've said, a real possibility of targeting that response. And my first sort of question for you is, do a bit of crystal ball gazing. What do you see as the sort of what the technology, the benefits that AI could bring in terms of bringing us out of this lockdown and reopening the economy?
I think you're completely right to observe that after the initial lockdown period, there is going to be a need to have more targeted approaches. One prominent article called this the hammer and the dance. And as we move from the hammer lockdown period, we go into the dance. In terms of the way that AI could be used, I think there are a lot of potential uses of the technology. One of the main ones is in terms of monitoring and providing active feedback on physical social interactions. And I understand this is actually already being done in some of Singapore's parks. This is something that Xiang points out to me in conversation, that AI can be used to look at the way that people are moving around and to provide real-time alerts if, for example, a public place becomes too full. And one can certainly see this being used in private businesses, not just in public spaces. So, for example, a restaurant, a bar, a shop, somewhere which would want to have human footfall in order to drive forward the economy, you could have this type of technology being used to work out whether people are getting too close together and to provide alerts. And the reason why this has an advantage over humans is, firstly, in terms of the manpower. It would be incredibly costly for private businesses to have marshals observing, and secondly, some of this some of these operations would be very difficult for a human to carry out, because physically it would be difficult to be looking at all of the different areas and all of the different interactions. One of the things which we may need to think about, and this links back to what Luke was discussing, is the extent to which we are comfortable with AI analyzing private personal data and making these types of determinations. And it may be that we are more comfortable with AI, which doesn't involve a human looking and judging and understanding what you're doing. We may be happier with AI being used in these areas than humans are. And I think we're likely to see a shift in social attitudes, certainly in countries where people have traditionally been a bit more reticent about the use of technology impacting on daily life. As we have this trade-off, this balance between opening up the economy and also maintaining public safety, I think there is likely to be a greater emphasis on the use of technology like these population tracking applications in order to manage that effectively.
Well, that's an interesting point. Okay, so let's run a sort of probably, hopefully, a worst case scenario. But let's say there is no vaccine. Let's say that the next 2 or 3 years, we've got a situation where there are spikes in infections and clusters, and commercially for certain industries, getting ahead of the curve on that can be really beneficial. You know, you're not going to go to X hotel if they've had an outbreak, or Y restaurant if they're going to have an outbreak. Could you see a situation where a big tech company comes out with an AI solution which leverages on a lot of data out there in order to provide business information to businesses to sort of help them determine which customers can come in, or help them to determine the rights of customers, I'll put it as broadly as possible, using their business or their premises. And if you do think that's a possibility, do you think there needs to be more regulation looked at in terms of what AI can be used for, given that we could have a very real situation of AI being leveraged to actually limit people's rights of movement, association and so on?
It's a great question. In answer to the first point, I absolutely can see there being a new service provided by software companies of providing analytics and providing data in this regard. And to give one example, I think this is actually likely to be happening already, or at least the development of these systems is likely to be happening already. Very early on in the UK government's response, they made an agreement with a technology company called Palantir, which essentially specializes in the derivation of analytics and analysis of large data sets about human and other types of interactions. And it's perhaps most well known for being used in the national security arena to predict terrorist attacks and to assist the police in catching mass murderers by analysis of phone records and things along those lines. The UK government reached an agreement with Palantir in which Palantir was to supply its Foundry, which is a service linking front-end and back-end data analytics together in an explainable way, for £1. So Palantir received £1 from the government for providing this service. And one has to think, what's Palantir getting from this? And the answer, I think, is the data. It's the analytics, and it's the understanding of this data, which is the quid pro quo for assisting the government. And I can certainly see that type of data and that type of analytics being used. Probably in a GDPR compliant way, not necessarily misusing data in the manner that Luke was mentioning as being impermissible earlier, but just simply using those analytics from the data, which is not necessarily protected in the same way as personal data is, in order to provide that as a service to businesses. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that Palantir are especially shady. If they can create value for businesses, there's no reason why they shouldn't derive a profit from creating that value, if that can assist businesses and assist the wider economy going forward. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think, though, that we need to be mindful of this, and that the public and governments need to be engaged and need to enter these types of agreements with open eyes. And that's why it's important that these types of agreements are coming to light. So turning to your second question, I do think it's important that we at least have a conversation about regulation. It may be that the answer from a societal perspective is that we don't want to have regulation, and each society will have to work that out themselves. As we've already discussed, there can be different cultural approaches to personal data, and I think there will also be different cultural approaches to the use of AI in decision making and how AI makes these difficult decisions, and whether there are decisions that AI shouldn't take. But we should at least start to have a meaningful discussion on that. And then the question of what regulation is developed is a secondary one, so long as we have had that debate at a governmental and societal level.
Thank you, Jacob. So I'm conscious of the time, and like all good discussions, they do tend to run over. We've got a good number of questions on the chat, the question and answer at the moment. But I would invite anybody who has any questions, please, and do put them on. We'll do our best to get through them all. And if you don't mind, we'll continue the discussion. But I'll introduce some of the questions as I think they touch on some of the topics we've just been talking about. We've got one question here for Jacob. Do private companies need to be concerned about AI regulatory compliance in the same way that they are now careful of their obligations concerning data privacy?
Thanks, really good question. I think private companies certainly do need to be concerned about compliance. I think there is, to some extent, a degree of blindness as to the impact of AI regulations and the fact that we are now across the world developing quite advanced and quite detailed best practices as regards how AI should be operated. But we haven't seen the large fines for organizations, like with the Marriott case that was being discussed by Xiang, and the British Airways case, where big organizations have had fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars for AI breaches. That's not to say this won't happen in the future. I think it will happen in the future. And I think there'll not just be regulatory actions against companies for the way they've used AI, but also that there may well be private actions, for example, mass tort claims based on the way that thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people's data has been used and analyzed, and the way in which decisions have been taken based on that. So what I tend to advise companies on this area is that now is absolutely the time to plan, because there is a lead time to getting your AI house in order. And if one simply waits until the first big fine comes and then says, okay, we need to be compliant with AI best practices and all the developing principles worldwide, you're likely to end up wasting a lot of money, because all of your systems will have been set up in a way which aren't necessarily compliant. So the thing to do right now is to plan for the future, because I think that in the long term, or indeed in the medium term, is likely to save organizations a significant amount of time and money.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Just checking I wasn't on mute. So another question, just generally for the panel, and so this is very Singapore focused. So my question is about the practical steps we can take as employers in Singapore in collecting and processing data for staff temperature during the working day. Safe check-in, and just by way of our non-Singapore-based listeners, Singapore has a procedure now with every building, whether it's a private business or a public building that you enter, you have to scan a QR code on your phone, put in your details. I think Zheng was mentioning this, check in, and then when you leave, you do the same process checking out. So safe check-in does the location basis, and companies don't process that data, of course, but companies do need to take staff temperature and keep records on their staff. Can you please share some practical guidance on how we can do this? And I presume that the question relates to how we can do this in accordance with the current data protection requirements, and any concerns there. Anybody would like to take that one? Luke?
I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I mean, I think the key thing we've been talking about already is data minimization, and I think the temptation is for employers to capture as much information as possible. So, if you're tracking where your employees, all of their personal travel, for example, whether you're tracking any symptoms that they may have, for example, loss of smell, loss of taste, those sorts of things. These are all very sensitive and personal issues. And I think that this comes back to the point that I would say is that as an employer, you need to be very, very aware that you are in a powerful position. So the employer-employee relationship is a power-based relationship. And I think that means that even if you ask for consent for your employees and say, can you tell us some of this information, and some of it could actually be very, very sensitive, then that consent is probably not going to be freely given, and especially in the economic circumstances that we are in at the moment with COVID-19. So I think the balance there is that you should really minimize the amount of data that you collect unless it's absolutely necessary. I mean, we certainly at Clifford Chance have been very, very careful about what we collect on visitors, on employees, and I think that we have to be very, very careful about how we actually store that data, where we collect it, how we store it. That the fact that, for example, practical issue, that if you come up to reception and you fill out your details and you get your temperature taken, that information is not available to the next person standing in line. that would be a disclosure of personal data, which would be in breach of the PDPA. So I think you need to be very, very careful about that. You need to minimize it. We also need to look at every step of the collection process, the storage process, the retention process. Do you need to keep visitors records for more than 21 days? Again, probably not. It's whatever you're required to keep as an employer, obviously. But I think it's very, very important that you do that. And I think that the other issue is that employers are in a difficult position here, because they've got to collect and minimize and retain securely all of this data. I understand that, but they've also got to keep a safe workplace, right? So there's an obligation to keep a safe workplace, which means you've got to balance that risk of allowing somebody into the workplace who has COVID and therefore infecting everybody else. And so I think that, all of those things, maybe it's quite high level, but I think you've got to look at each step of the process and say, are you collecting it properly? Are you storing it properly? And consider that employee-employer relationship, which I think is very, very important to be aware of.
Just to pick up on that, and again, for everybody, and maybe Luke also, you'd have a view on this. Do you think there's a case for government to actually legislate on, put in place specific bespoke legislation on what companies, individuals should be doing in terms of collecting this data, what data should be collected, how it should be stored, and effectively carving out obligations out of the data protection legislation?
Yeah, I mean, there actually have been, so there's the big issue is around kind of function creep or scope creep. So the fact that you're collecting data for one purpose. So in the employer-employee relationship, again, if you're collecting all of this data around your employees, and then you use that data, not for COVID tracing, but you use it for disciplinary procedures, for that employee, that's obviously a function creep. It's a move away. You didn't collect it for that purpose. You should not be using it for that secondary purpose. And I think there's a real temptation for employers to do that. And function creep is a big issue. And we've seen some very, very good examples, or very bad examples of this, actually, of where, so in the US, and in 2017, in California, they decided to use, the law enforcement decided to use a database that was called GED Match, which is essentially biometric, genetic info that was collected, and it was collected from people willingly given for tracing their ancestors. But what the law enforcement authorities did is they used that to actually catch a killer. So they caught the Golden State Killer, who was in the 1970s a serial rapist and murderer in California. Now, obviously, if you look at that balance, most people would say, well, actually, that's good. That's a good thing that they caught this person. But actually, the knock-on effect of this was that when this database was then made available to other law enforcement agencies, actually less than 15% of people said that they could use that information, because they were very unhappy about that information was being used for a completely different purpose for what they gave it for. And I think it's a very good example of where you have function creep. And yes, it may be very laudable, some of the things that you want to do with this information, but actually, if you're using it for a different purpose and what you collected, you need to be very, very careful, because what it will mean is that you lose the trust of the employee and the general public.
That's an interesting one. I remember there was a case of an organisation we were involved with who had an employee, I believe, who was displaying symptoms, came in, and that information was then used. But then there was a question mark over was it a disciplinary offence or a breach of his employment contract, because he or she came in with symptoms and should have stayed at home. Yes, I mean that could be an example. We've got another question here, which I'll cover, and might require a little bit of background information. The question is this: Cambridge Analytical is a good example of a data breach. Do we need to be more wary, and does there need to be more protection against future breaches? And I presume that the person asking this question is looking at could we see a similar situation of an organisation such as Cambridge Analytical? And by way of background, and I'm sure other panels will know more about this than me, but Cambridge Analytical was very much in the press recently for data mining, misappropriating digital assets, using data brokerage and so on to basically gather data in order to engage in strategic communications to assist various political parties in different countries. And obviously that was very controversial. Do you think there's a risk of similar types of scandals occurring in the future, but with, in this case, using health data which has been acquired through the COVID-19 fight?
I think that data leaks have been rising, and that's really down to the general practice that more and more data repositories are appearing. That being said, when the functional advantage of having data repositories and that you can apply analytics on them to derive value-added outcomes is there, many organizations have actually pursued that in the absence of consideration of risk management or general cybersecurity protection measures that would be necessary to protect this information. I mean, just in the last 6 months, we are seeing service providers that have been compromised and their customers are suffering for it. Names come to mind such as the Xiang recently. That is a managed service provider for many companies. It is a technology service that they provide, and all the customers are impacted and they are still discovering what is the damage that they are facing in terms of not just the service that they depended on. That's also the kinds of information that they have exchanged with the service provider, which may include personal identifiable information. And what would these mean to some of these individuals? Going back to some of the implications, for example, Target, where some of the customers' information were rolled out, were leaked. It is important to note that they actually considered credit monitoring for their customers, which for many others that have personal identifiable information leaked, they don't even consider that. And that actually puts a credit risk at minimum to the individuals, if not for surveillance, monitoring, or extortion, as I've highlighted in some of the other examples. So these are important things to consider. And I think really it goes back to my earlier point that every technology has vulnerabilities. And that's mainly because technologies are built up by humans and to err is human, right? So we need to be more vigilant as solutions developed to actually find the vulnerabilities, patch them up quickly, and ensure that that basic level of cyber hygiene is continued. So that would be one angle that I would put forward. A bit earlier, there was this question about practical management of collection of the data. And I'm aware that some of my clients, particularly the small and medium enterprises, some of them, they're really keeping manual records or hard copy records about the guests that are coming in or the temperature of their employees. Some have gone into a bit more digital, so you have Excel spreadsheets that are monitoring day-to-day visitors as well as their employee data. Some have gone to using elaborate systems. So for example, Canon Asia has recently launched kind of a tablet-like device that actually scans every single visitor, monitoring their temperature and kind of keep it in a secure database to just help manage this kind of information. And so these are all the different maturities in which solutions are out there. Now, that being said, this only helps with the management of information. It does not necessarily mean that this is more secure or less secure, but at least it is a structured and organized way of collecting the data. On minimization of information, I think from just sharing from the Singapore government perspective is that all the national identities are all aggregated into these two repositories known as SingPass for authentication and then MyInfo for the collection of citizen data. And so that is kind of the way in which when we look at safe entry as well as trace together, these applications actually leverage on the information that already exists, rather than to say, I need to capture all your data, whether you are male, female, or any other gender, what kind of household do you live in, and so on and so forth, because those data sets already exist. And to that extent, that's the government's approach of not collecting duplicated information. So I just wanted to touch on a little of that.
Thanks, Xiang. Okay, I'm conscious that it's gone 1/2 past the hour, and this is an hour and a half presentation. So we'll bring it to a close there. Although I'm sure we could go on for an awful lot longer. I'd like to, on behalf of the Chamber, to thank all three of our speakers. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I've certainly learned a lot on this. I believe Sabina is going to put up a slide on the upcoming Chamber events. At the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore, we've got regular events coming up for our members, which are also available for non-members to attend. Obviously, naturally, given that we're not out of the circuit breaker here in Singapore, a lot of these will be webinars, but we're hoping that will change. We've got a mental health at work during COVID-19 webinar coming up on the 14th of July. We've got the Changing Economic Outlook, Healthcare Industry in Southeast Asia, which will be another webinar on the 22nd of July. And on the 21st of July, we have an event on the energy and the circular economy. So if anybody obviously has feedback, there, I believe you'll have some information sent to you via email if you've registered for this event. So if you've got any feedback how these presentations could be improved, or maybe what you enjoyed, please do let us know. But once again, thank you very much to the speakers, and thanks to everybody for